You can now support Ghost Maps on Patreon and buy our official merchandise on Redbubble. Simply look for We Are Hantu or click the links in the description. Ghost Maps, Entry 30, Manila, Philippines. Lewis has been living in Singapore for about 5 years now, and he's been clean and sober for 15. We're sitting at a coffee shop along Kampong Baru Road, a short walk away from his flat on a gloomy Saturday evening. Outside, the wind's howling loudly, the clouds threatening rain, but the ominous weather stands in complete contrast to Lewis's disposition. He lets out a hearty laugh as he tells me that being a non-drinker while working in public relations tends to raise eyebrows. There's this weird impression among people who aren't in the industry that it's nothing but glitz, glamour, and decadence, he says, waving his hand flamboyantly as he rolls his eyes. I mean, yeah, there's all of that, but do they think we're planning these events while chugging Chardonnay? Sobriety, of course, didn't come easy for him. When he started his career back in the Philippines, Lewis, just like everyone else, fell for that idea that PR was all about overindulging. We didn't have a lot growing up, so I guess once I started doing well, I swung way too far in that other direction. Work hard, play harder, you know? He says, matter-of-factly. He tells me that whenever he was under the influence, he was obnoxious, belligerent, and at his worst, verbally abusive. He says he's not using the drinks and the drugs as an excuse though. They brought up the worst in me, but the fact is that all of that was in me to begin with, he tells me, his mood somehow still up despite the less than cheery turn the conversation's taken. He says that he eventually went sober thanks to an intervention from his mom and his partner at the time. But there was an incident before that intervention that certainly helped shake him out of his perpetual stupor. So I take that as my cue, fish my recorder out of my bag, and when everything's set up, I ask him to start from the beginning. It was 15 years ago. Lewis had finished an event for a luxury watch brand at a hotel in downtown Manila at 10 p.m. He had spent the 4 hours after partying. When it finally came time for him to head home, he'd managed to hop into a cab and blacked out almost immediately. When he came to, he found himself not at home, but lying along the shoulder of an empty highway. It took him a second or two before he figured out roughly where he was. The highway was about a 20-minute walk away from his flat. As he stood up and dusted himself off, Lewis realized that his phone and wallet were missing. Slurring out a curse, he staggered down the highway till he found an exit and stumbled off into a dimly lit road, mildly busier than the highway. A couple of cars passed him, but judging by the look of the neighborhood, he knew better than to try and hail them down and ask for a lift. Eventually, after stopping to throw up twice, he turned a corner in front of an old high school building and came across a forested area that seemed to span a couple of blocks. Lewis spun around a bit, trying to get his bearings. He was still nursing the effects of that night's Molly and champagne, but he certainly wasn't inebriated enough to plunge headfirst into a pitch-black forest. Looking up and down the street, though, he reasoned out that this seemed to be the only way. So, hesitantly, he stumbled into the forest. Covering up a creeping sense of fear by slurring out more curses at the cabbie who'd robbed him, Lewis moved as quickly as he could through the trees. Even though he knew he was heading straight ahead, he kept getting the sense that he was somehow hopelessly lost, his eyes darting left and right for some sign that he was on the right path. Soon enough, he thought he heard the sound of cars up ahead and breathed a sigh of relief, the fear giving way to some semblance of sobriety. But that's when he heard laughter. It didn't sound malicious. It wasn't a cackle or anything like that. In fact, it was almost joyous. Lewis assumed at first that it was a woman from up ahead, where the cars were. But then he realized she seemed a whole lot closer. His eyes darted around faster, left and right, left and right. But he couldn't catch sight of her. And then he realized why. That laughter wasn't coming from around him. It was coming from above him. Lewis caught a glimpse of a human-shaped shadow up in the trees. I thought it was hopping from branch to branch at first, he says. But then I started to realize that it wasn't moving. It just disappeared and reappeared somewhere else. Throughout it all, the laughter remained joyous, but eerily so. Lewis started sprinting as fast as he could towards where the sound of cars was coming from. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, civilization seemed to always be out of reach. After a while, however, exhaustion and the remaining effects of the night's decadence caught up with him. The last thing he remembered before blacking out again was the sound of soft footsteps on the grass behind him, and that laughter right by his ear. When Lewis finally woke up again, he was back in his flat, lying on the couch. As he sat up, he was immediately overcome with nausea. Running to the bathroom, he threw up, more forcefully than he had the night before or on any other night. As the nausea eventually subsided, Lewis sat beside the bowl, his eyes shut, trying to piece together how he got back, when he heard the chittering of an insect. He didn't pay much attention at first, but the noise started to gnaw at him, devolving into a low buzz that seemed to overpower everything else. Opening his eyes, he winced as he looked around to find the offending bug, but couldn't see any around. Suddenly, it occurred to him where that sound was coming from. Hesitantly, he leaned over to look into the bowl. I had been cursed by a Mangkukulam, Lewis tells me, a witch. He's not sure who had asked for the curse, but he says with a chuckle that it's not like he was short of enemies at the time. He called his mother as soon as he managed to pull himself out of the toilet, and she in turn called a shaman to come over and help. He managed to alleviate the curse, but the after effects, a fever and this constant nausea, stayed with me for what felt like the longest 2 weeks of my life, Lewis says. And of course, I absolutely refused to throw up again. Despite everything he went through though, he was back to overindulging just a couple of weeks after his ordeal. If anything, more so than before. You can't be frightened out of addiction, he says. It's something you need to want to overcome. He goes quiet for just a moment, and I realize that's the first time he used that word all afternoon. Addiction. I raise my mug, and with a smile, break the silence. Hey, I'll toast to that, I tell him. If you want to discover more of Southeast Asia's other side, subscribe now and follow us on social media at We Are Hantu. You can also buy official merchandise on Redbubble and be one of our supporters on Patreon. Ghost Maps is recorded on Audio Technica mics.